You're listening to a Tax Justice Network podcast covering the 10 worst global offenders identified by the Financial Secrecy Index in 2018. Once again, Switzerland is in first place with a high secrecy score of 76.45 out of 100, and in terms of size with 4.5% of the global market. I'm Naomi Fowler, talking to Tax Justice campaigner Anthea Lawson. Switzerland, number one in the Financial Secrecy Index, again. How would you summarise Switzerland as a jurisdiction?
OK, so look, it's still first. It was first last time. It was first the time before. It was the first the time before that. It's a bit of a cliche, isn't it? If you ask the person on the street about Switzerland, they'll say, yes, that's where you can hide your money. But there seems to be a truth in some of these cliches. Switzerland's share of the global market in offshore financial services is massive. It's 20%. That's gone down just over 1% since last time. But its secrecy score since 2015 has gone up by 5%, and that's mainly due to the fact that we've added some new indicators this time, and it's not scoring very well on them. But there isn't really a massive improvement in the scores on the indicators that were used last time. So here it is at the top of the ranking with some major secrecy problems.
Right, so Swiss banking secrecy is not dead, as it's been reported to be several times.
Yeah, that's right. So a few years ago, there was a lot of talk about this being the end of banking secrecy. And this was when the American authorities were going after UBS for helping Americans evade tax. This was when the Americans were bringing in FATCA, which is a bit of legislation requiring banks overseas to report information on American taxpayers. But that's about transmission of information to the US. When you look at what Switzerland itself is doing, it's still doing many of the things it was doing before. So let's have a look at what some of those are. It's still a crime to report a crime under bank secrecy laws, which is a huge constraint on whistleblowers who see something wrong going on. It's still got problems sticking to the global anti-money laundering standard, which is what requires banks and other financial operators to check who they're dealing with. So even after the big leak from HSBC a few years ago, which showed that HSBC's Swiss arm was taking money linked to dictators and arms dealers, the Financial Action Task Force, which checks whether countries are doing what they ought to on anti-money laundering, found that there's no general and systematic obligation to take reasonable measures to verify the identity of the beneficial owners of customers. What does that mean in English? That means it's entirely possible for Swiss banks to accept money without knowing who it's really from. That is a major problem. Another thing, analysis of the Panama Papers leak found that Switzerland was in first place in terms of the home countries of banks that were acting as intermediaries to set up offshore companies in Panama. And while we're on the subject of secrecy, it's still possible to set up a company in Switzerland that doesn't even have its legal ownership recorded, let alone the real ultimate ownership. That adds up to quite a serious secrecy package.
Right, so Swiss banking secrecy is very much alive.
Yeah.
Switzerland has tried to forge its own way ahead with transparency measures when it comes to the exchange of information between countries on an automatic multilateral basis. Tell us about that.
Well, Switzerland has signed up and has joined this process for automatic exchange of tax information between countries. But there are a couple of problems with it. At each stage of the process of joining the system, Switzerland has tried to prevaricate. So one of the problems with the new rules for automatic exchange of tax information is that countries can sign up to it and get brownie points for doing so, but they still get to choose which countries they exchange information with, a bit like a tax version of a dating site. Now, this is a problem with the OECD system overall. But what Switzerland did is said, well, OK, first our priority is going to be the America and EU countries as countries to exchange with. Then we'll prioritise countries where we have political and economic ties and countries which offer scope for, quotes, regularisation. What does that mean? That means countries which offer amnesties for tax crimes committed via Swiss banking. So countries that are not in the EU or the OECD have to wait at least until 2019, which gives tax evaders another year to shift their loot. And then in the Swiss parliament, a right-wing party pushed to have an individual vote in parliament on each country that Switzerland was proposing to share information with to make sure they had enough anti-corruption measures in place. Now, They did agree to share information with a number of countries, but there's a great irony in this, in focusing that on anti-corruption, because corruption in many countries is still being facilitated by Swiss banking. Now, what all this means in practice is that Switzerland is willing to exchange with rich countries and less willing to exchange with poorer countries. To be fair, Switzerland's not the only country doing this. But what that means is that poor countries, which are arguably those most in need of their tax revenues, are getting less willing help than richer countries.
Right, and that brings us on to the subject of the pressure that Switzerland's being put under from a human rights perspective from the United Nations, who are monitoring much more nowadays the effect that the loss of tax revenue in poorer countries has on women, children, the poorest people in the world in some of those countries.
Yes, the link is increasingly being understood between tax evasion and human rights. So in 2016, the United Nations called on Switzerland to do impact assessments of the effect of its financial secrecy and corporate tax policies on women's rights overseas, and this was following a big submission from a lot of NGOs. Now, how might that happen? So Swiss financial secrecy denies tax revenues to countries that need them to pay for vital services. As has been shown in many places, if vital services aren't being paid for, that undermines women's rights because it's usually women who are left to fill the care gaps when these services are not provided. And it's possible that Swiss financial secrecy may mean that it's failing in its commitments under two major treaties to which it's a signatory, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights.
Another thing that's quite interesting in the development in the future of the Swiss secrecy business model is that it's looking to some of the emerging economies, as they're known, or the BRICS nations, to increase business, according to a Swiss banking whistleblower and a staff member who used to work for the bank UBS, Stephanie Gibaud.
Yeah, it seems that the Swiss banks are doing what they do best, as all banks do, and looking for new clients. So this whistleblower suggested that what happened after the US authorities went after UBS a few years ago is it adopted a new strategy of seeking clients elsewhere in countries that so far haven't been hassling Switzerland to the same extent to get their taxpayers to cough up. And if you look what UBS says about the countries where it's expanding its wealth management business, it lists Mexico, Brazil, Turkey, Russia, Israel and Saudi Arabia.